Even the darkest of clouds carry a silver lining if you are brave enough to look for the light in the shadows. Join our journey through life's toughest challenges as we find the beauty hidden within the struggle. Subscribe today and always find the light with us.
That was 6 weeks before everything changed. The new VP of technology had been in his chair for exactly 11 days when he walked into my server room like he owned the place, which technically he thought he did. He was 29 years old. His name was Ethan Marsh. He had a master's degree from Carnegie Mellon, 3 years at a fintech startup that got acquired, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having watched a system you built actually fail in production at 2 in the morning. I've been watching systems fail at 2 in the morning for 23 years. My name is Joel Hargrove, and at the time I was the senior infrastructure architect at Meridian Health Partners, a regional healthcare network covering 4 hospitals, 11 outpatient clinics, and somewhere around 340,000 active patient records. I'd been there since 2001. I remember the exact year because my youngest daughter was born 3 weeks after I signed the offer letter, and I told my wife that this was the job I was going to retire from. I almost did, just not the way I planned. When Meridian was acquired by a private equity group out of Atlanta in early 2024, I knew things were going to change. That's fine. Acquisitions happen. What I didn't expect was Ethan Marsh. He showed up in February with a mandate he'd apparently written himself, modernize the entire infrastructure stack within 18 months. That included migrating our on-premise patient data systems to a cloud-based platform, sunsetting what he called our legacy architecture, and this is the part I want you to remember, replacing the core database layer I had spent the better part of a decade building and customizing specifically for HIPAA-compliant healthcare data. The first time he came into my office, he looked at my whiteboard, which had the system architecture mapped out in 3 colors, and said, "This looks like something from a CompuServe tutorial." I told him I was happy to walk him through it. He said, "That's okay, we're replacing it anyway." That was our first real conversation. Over the next few weeks, I tried. I genuinely tried. I put together a 47-page technical risk assessment. I outlined the compliance dependencies. I explained which parts of our system handled protected health information, which modules had been audited by CMS 3 separate times, which data pipelines had been custom built because off-the-shelf solutions couldn't meet our specific retention and encryption requirements under the business associate agreements we had with our insurance partners. He read approximately none of it. What he did do was bring in a consulting firm from Denver, 4 guys in their late 20s who had never worked in healthcare IT, not one of them, and let them spend 2 weeks evaluating my architecture. Their final report called it overly complex, difficult to maintain, and this is the quote I still have saved, a patchwork of outdated conventions that reflects a pre-cloud mindset. Ethan forwarded that report to me with a single line. Thoughts? I wrote back a 4-paragraph response explaining the specific technical reasons each of their criticisms missed the point. He never replied. What he did about 3 weeks later was schedule a meeting. Me, him, HR, and a woman from the parent company's legal team who dialed in from Atlanta and spent the whole call on mute. The meeting was at 3:15 on a Thursday afternoon. I know because I still have the calendar invite. He told me that the organization was moving in a new direction, and that my skill set, while valuable in a legacy context, wasn't aligned with the modern infrastructure vision they were building toward. He said it with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed it in a mirror. HR slid a separation agreement across the table. I looked at it for a moment. Then I said, "I'll need to have my attorney review this before I sign anything." He looked faintly surprised, like he'd expected me to just take the pen. I didn't take the pen. What he didn't know, what neither he nor anyone at that company had apparently bothered to check, was what my original employment contract said, not the standard agreement they'd been handing new hires since 2018. My original contract, the one I'd negotiated in 2001, when Meridian was still a single hospital operation and they needed someone who could build their entire technical infrastructure from nothing. Section 9, paragraph 4. I'd had my attorney put it in myself, 23 years ago, because I'd watched a colleague at a previous job get walked out the door and lose ownership of a scheduling system he'd spent 4 years writing on his own time. I wasn't going to let that happen to me. The language was specific. any proprietary system, custom module, or architectural component developed by me that was not explicitly covered by a written work-for-hire agreement signed by both parties would revert entirely to my ownership in the event of termination without 90 days written notice. The clause had survived 3 rounds of contract renewals because, frankly, no one had ever looked at it closely enough to remove it. I was a known quantity. I showed up. I kept the systems running. I didn't make trouble. The custom database layer Ethan Marsh wanted to replace, I had developed the core of it on my own time in my home office in 2009 before bringing it to Meridian under a licensing arrangement I had also negotiated myself. That arrangement was documented. The original licensing terms were attached to my contract as Exhibit C. Exhibit C said the license was contingent on my continued employment. I went home that Thursday evening and sat at the kitchen table for about an hour. My wife came in and asked if I was okay. I told her I needed to make a call. I called my attorney, a man named Richard who I've known since we were in the same adult softball league in 2003, and I explained the situation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Joel, did they give you the 90 days?" I said, "No." Another pause. "Did they give you anything in writing before today?" "No." I could hear him doing the math. "Send me the separation agreement and your original contract tonight," he said. "Don't sign anything. Don't respond to any emails about transition timelines. Don't say a word." I didn't say a word. I spent the weekend mowing the lawn, watching football, and trying not to think too hard about what was coming. My daughter called on Saturday. I told her I was between jobs. She said, "Dad, you're never between jobs." I told her that's true. I'm just between employers. Richard called me Monday morning. He told me that Section 9, Paragraph 4 was enforceable. He told me that Exhibit C was clear. He told me that because I had been terminated without the required notice, the licensing agreement for the database layer had lapsed, effective the date of my termination, and that under the terms of my original contract, full ownership of that architecture had reverted to me. He also told me something I hadn't thought about. "You built the encryption key management system too, didn't you?" I had. In 2014, after a CMS audit identified a gap in how we were handling PHI encryption at rest, I built the solution over about 6 weeks. It was in my contract as a separately documented module. Same terms. Richard said, "They don't own that either." I want to be clear about something. I am not a vindictive person. I have never been the kind of man who wants to watch other people suffer. I have a comfortable life, a paid-off house, and a pension that, combined with what I'd saved, meant I wasn't going to be desperate. I didn't need to do anything dramatic. But I also wasn't going to pretend that what they did was acceptable. 23 years. I had documentation of every major architectural decision I'd made for that organization. I had receipts, literally and figuratively. And a 29-year-old who had never worked a single day in regulated healthcare thought he could walk me out of my own building and just keep everything I'd built. Richard sent the letter on a Wednesday morning. It was 13 pages. It outlined the specific components I owned, the dates of development, the contract language, the applicable sections of intellectual property law, and the timeline of my termination. It included a formal demand that Meridian Health Partners cease using my proprietary systems immediately or enter into a new licensing agreement at a rate Richard and I had discussed, $28,000 per month. It also noted that any continued use without agreement would constitute IP infringement, and that given the nature of the systems involved, specifically the PHI encryption module, continued unauthorized use could create compliance exposure under HIPAA with potential OCR penalty implications. I'm told the letter arrived at 9:14 in the morning. By 11:30, Richard had received a call from Meridian's outside counsel. By Tony, Meridian's outside counsel had figured out what I'd known for 2 weeks. They couldn't migrate away from my database architecture in any reasonable timeline. The consulting firm from Denver had told them the migration would take 6 months minimum. That was before they understood what the encryption module actually did. Once they understood what the encryption module actually did, specifically, that it was the keystone of their PHI data integrity framework and that pulling it out without a fully validated replacement would create a reportable data vulnerability, the 6-month estimate became something closer to 18 months. They had 340,000 patient records sitting in a system they no longer had a license to run. I found out later, from a friend who still worked there, that Ethan Marsh spent most of that Wednesday in a conference room with the door closed, that at some point in the afternoon he asked someone to pull my original employment contract, that when someone finally found Exhibit C and read it carefully, the room got very quiet. I found out that the CEO of the parent company called in from Atlanta. I found out that someone asked more than once, "Why didn't anyone tell us about this before the acquisition?" The answer to that question was simple, because I hadn't told them. It wasn't my job to protect them from their own due diligence failures, or their new VP's failure to read a contract before walking a 23-year employee out of his own building. Richard negotiated for the better part of 3 weeks. The final agreement was not $28,000 a month. It was more than that. I'm not going to give you the exact number because part of the settlement included terms I'm choosing to respect, but I will tell you that it covered a multi-year licensing arrangement, a formal consulting engagement for the duration of the migration, and a one-time payment for the period between my termination and the signing of the new agreement, during which they had been using my systems without a valid license. The consulting engagement paid $650 an hour. I know some of you are going to say that's too low. Maybe you're right. I'm 57 years old and I've never charged by the hour in my life. Richard told me it was fair market for the engagement scope and that I should take it. I took it. The first day I came back into that building, I signed in at the front desk as a contractor. The same receptionist who had been there for 8 years gave me a visitor badge. I walked past the office that used to be mine. It had already been reassigned to one of the Denver consultants, and I went to the server room and I started doing the work. Ethan Marsh was in the building for about 3 more weeks after that. I saw him twice in the hallway. We did not speak. He left the company in early spring. I don't know exactly what happened and I don't particularly need to know. What I do know is this. The migration project is still ongoing. I consult on it twice a week. They call me when something breaks. They call me when the Denver team hits a wall they can't get through. Last month, they called me at 6:45 in the morning because a configuration change had created a gap in the audit log and they were worried about a CMS review coming up in November. I fixed it in about 40 minutes. I fixed it before. I built the thing. I know exactly where every wire goes. There's a specific kind of satisfaction in that, not the revenge part, not the money part, though I'd be lying if I said neither of those things mattered. The satisfaction is in the knowledge that the work you did was real, that it held, that 23 years of decisions made carefully, systems built to last, problems solved at 2 in the morning when no one was watching, all of it was real, and all of it mattered, and no amount of consultants from Denver telling you it looks outdated changes the fact that it works. Ethan Marsh called my architecture outdated. It was. Parts of it were genuinely old. I never claimed otherwise. But there's a difference between old and wrong. There's a difference between hard to understand and not worth understanding. And there is a very specific kind of expensive lesson waiting for anyone who can't tell the difference between the two. My daughter called me last month. She's in tech herself, product management at a software company out in Seattle. She asked me how the consulting was going. I told her it was going fine. She asked if I felt weird going back. I thought about it for a second. I told her it doesn't feel weird at all. It feels exactly like what it is. I'm the person who knows how this works. I've always been the person who knows how this works. The difference now is that everybody in that building understands that too. She laughed and said, "Dad, did you plan this?" I told her the truth. I didn't plan it, but I was prepared for it. There's a difference, and that difference took me 23 years to learn how to make. If you're watching this and you've spent years building something, a system, a process, a body of work, and someone younger with a shinier resume is telling you it's outdated, I want you to hear something clearly. Know what you own. Read your contract. Understand what you built and what it's worth and what happens to it if the wrong person decides you're not worth keeping around. The best leverage I ever had was sitting in a filing cabinet in my home office. I'd put it there in 2001 because a lawyer told me to, and I was too new to the industry to argue with him. Best advice I ever took. If you got something out of this, hit like. If you've been in a situation like this, or if you know someone who has, leave a comment. I read them, every one of them. I'll see you next time. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the legal part, not the contract clause, but the thing underneath all of it. The reason Ethan Marsh could walk into a building he'd been in for 11 days and dismiss 23 years of work without blinking, it wasn't arrogance exactly. Or not only that, it was a specific kind of blindness that comes from never having been wrong in a way that cost you anything real. He'd moved fast his whole career. Things had worked out. And when you've only ever seen the upside of moving fast, you start to believe that speed is the same thing as intelligence. That new is the same thing as better. That if something looks complicated, that's a flaw in the thing, not a gap in your understanding of it. I don't say that to be cruel to him. I say it because I've watched it happen enough times to know it's a pattern, not a personality. The people who walk into rooms and start tearing things down before they've learned what holds the ceiling up. They're not rare. They show up in every industry, in every generation. And they always believe they're the exception to every lesson that came before them. What I kept coming back to, sitting at my kitchen table that Thursday night, was that I hadn't done anything clever. I hadn't outmaneuvered him. I had simply done what I'd always done. I built things carefully. I documented everything. And 23 years earlier, I listened to a lawyer who told me to protect what I created. That's it. There was no scheme. There was no plan. There was just the slow, unglamorous accumulation of doing the right thing consistently for a very long time. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Not the invoice. Not the licensing agreement. The 23 years of showing up, of fixing things at 2 in the morning when no one was watching, of writing documentation that no one read until suddenly they desperately needed to. The work itself was the leverage. The contract just made it legible. I think about the colleague I mentioned, the one who lost his scheduling system at a previous job. Years before I came to Meridian, he built something real. He just hadn't protected it. He walked away with nothing and spent years rebuilding from scratch. And I watched that happen, and I decided quietly that it wasn't going to happen to me. Not out of greed, out of respect for my own work. If you spend years of your life building something that matters, you don't hand it over because someone with a new title decided it was inconvenient. There's a kind of integrity in that, in knowing the value of what you've created and refusing to be talked out of it by someone who never bothered to understand it. That's not ego. Ego is what Ethan Marsh had when he called my database ancient garbage in a building he'd occupied for under 2 weeks. What I had was something quieter. It was just knowing what I knew, and trusting that it was worth something even when a 29-year-old in a good suit was telling me otherwise. What happened to Ethan Marsh isn't the point of this story. People like him land somewhere, they move on. They find another room to walk into and they start the process over again. And eventually, if they're lucky, reality teaches them the thing that experience was trying to teach them all along. What I want you to take away is simpler than any of that. Whatever you've built, in your career, in your field, over years of quiet, serious work, know what it is. Know what it's worth. Read your contracts. Ask the questions. Talk to someone who can help you understand what you actually own. Because the day may come when someone decides your work is inconvenient and the only thing standing between you and walking away with nothing is whether you did your homework before that day arrived. I did mine in 2001 because a lawyer I barely knew told me to. I'm glad I listened.